you very much, all of you, for coming out. I was wondering who would be curious about these projects and why they're interesting. To us, we find ourselves at a remarkable time in our lives and our country, and why were we interested in doing this particular project? The most overused term in the environmental movement, any of you have ever heard me speak before, I must always start with this slide because it is overused, but it's still really good. I didn't know who said it, but it's Rene Dubois in 1972. And we really think of 375 Pearl in this Verizon building in this context. What's going on globally, and how can we change our city locally in one building at a time? We saw the watershed event happen about mid-06. Prior to this, it's 4 Times Square, the Condé Nast building that Doug Mass worked on, and the first green skyscraper. Things started changing pretty quick, but it was still the NRDC newsletter. And about 06, this happens to be the Vanity Fair article where people are taking climate change and CO2 rise in the atmosphere really seriously. Then an inconvenient truth happened. So almost all of this action is in the background of climate change and CO2 rise in the atmosphere. As architects, what have we got to do with that? I grew up in the era in the 70s thinking that transportation, cars were the problem, tailpipe emissions were the problem, and now most people accept around 40%. This data is 43% of CO2 emissions come from buildings. In Plan YC, they include industry and say in New York City, 79% of CO2 emissions come from buildings. So clearly as architects and as builders and as developers, we find ourselves in a very prominent position that we can't ignore this issue with the work that we do. This is Carol's point. There's 5 billion square feet of buildings in New York City, and the Plan YC document estimates that in 2030, 85% of the buildings that will exist are buildings that exist right now. So if we really want to make a difference fast, yes, we're the architects for a building called One Bryant Park, a Bank of America Tower at One Bryant Park, 2.2 million square feet at LEED Platinum standard. But that's 5 years of our life so far with another 9 months to go. So the quickest way to make a significant difference is redo the existing stock, and that's really Carol's point. The Plan YC document talks about a reduction of 33 million tons of CO2 a year. And of that, 16.4 million tons will be saved by making buildings more efficient. So if you look at 2005, 58 million tons, 2030, 90 million tons projected. And the chart on the right is really talking about how Plan YC plans on doing that. So the escalation planned and a reduction as part of Plan YC. And a big part of it is right here in the efficient buildings. So there's clean power, there's avoided sprawl, there's sustainable transit. So a big part of this is in efficient buildings, new and existing. All right. Why is that really important? There's another thing called peaking loads, peak loads. 90% of the smog in our city is produced by 50% of the power plants. There's something called peaker power plants. Picture August 14th, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The dirtiest power plants all get turned online to meet our peak demand. So the best thing we can also do is, besides use less energy, use it at the right time or clip the peak load. So office buildings kind of have a peak load in the middle of the afternoon. So there's a base load that rises, a cooling load that rises, and use very, very little energy at night and then peak up again. And all the buildings are all doing this at the same time. So the ideal scenario is to clip that off, fill in the lows, reduce the peaks, and diminish that peak load so that we're using our cleanest power plants. How can you do this? Ice storage. Ice storage is one of the ways to do that. Use power when it's really cheap at night. It uses just as much energy, even a little bit more energy, but it's using it at a time that's much cheaper and much better for the environment. Okay. The other thing is how most of these things get paid for isn't really the save the planet stuff. Most of it is actually in quality. They're better buildings. Green buildings are better buildings. The air is quantifiably better. So at the Condé Nast building, 85% particulate filtration. At One Bryant Park, 95% particulate filtration on the incoming air. And at 375 Pearl, we're also doing 25% particulate filtration on the incoming air. Quantifiably the highest quality air you could have in an indoor work environment. Daylight, there's a big dilemma we have right now. What's so green about an all-glass skyscraper? Well, there are inherent conflicts there. We have been on the side of health and productivity, and that it's one of the few things that we can quantify as rise in human health and productivity, which is access to daylight, changing daylight environment. So we're doing that. The key tie is high-performance glass walls and daylight dimming on the interior. All of our work, we like to go back and try to understand what's special about this one unique place, unlike any other place on Earth. So you can see the red dot here. Pearl Street, which seems very discontinuous, was actually part of a historical street, right, on the early Manhattan maps. This is 375 Pearl right here. And Peter, what was it? Queen Street is what this is? Queen Street is the historic Queen Street that comes along. I like this image. This is the Friedrich's view of Lower Manhattan. I think it's 1646. The tallest thing on the skyline of Manhattan was wind power, and that the transportation was wind power, and even at the seal of New York City. This is our current seal of New York City. At the center of the seal is a wind-powered device. So we're exploring wind harvesting on the project also. And the 800-pound gorilla for our site was that when the Brooklyn Bridge was built, it severed a whole neighborhood in half by the Brooklyn Bridge. And to this day, this project has to deal with that. There's a neighborhood south of the Brooklyn Bridge and a neighborhood north of the Brooklyn Bridge. At the same time, this is arguably one of the greatest pieces of infrastructure architecture in America. All right, all of our projects, we like to think about what's free, what can be harvested for free. So all of our projects, whether it's a floor of interiors at the Empire State Building that we're doing for Skanska, or our office, which was the first LEED Platinum project in New York, it's what's there that you can harvest that has no environmental impact, that we can use and exploit its resources without using more stuff. On top of that, there's the sun is free, rain is free, bioprocesses, the earth is a heat sink, and wind. At 375 Pearl, one of the things that was free, as Doug just mentioned, was the whole building was free. They bought the project for the price of the land. So what we found is underneath that ugly skin is this kind of remarkable structure. Because engineers designed it, not architects, there's this beautiful cross-brace frame that runs around the whole project. Each one of these, what we call bustles, are where the wires were, and inside of that is this core of this beautiful diagrid that was designed purely by engineering concept. And most of these buildings, the Verizon buildings, had crazy floor-to-floor heights. I was just talking to Dan Shannon, and their building's the same way, 1095. It was all designed for the equipment that was going in. So there's this very, very interesting diagrid. This back quarter actually cantilevers out over the high school, and what we saw was free was this whole frame that we got for free. On top of that, we were thinking about this project not in the context of an early 70s building rehab, but that it's really in the spirit of purpose-built buildings that were better for a modern use than if they had been built as housing or as office buildings. So we're saying that this is a much better new workplace than if it had been built as an office building. Why is that? Higher floor-to-floor heights. Inside, this is just a photograph we took the other day. We have extremely high-quality dust-proof concrete because this is racking and stacking. And the other thing you can see is that the girders are double girders framed around this, around the columns. So there's beams framing into girders, and that the bottoms of the beams and the girders are about the same height for the efficiency of racking wires overhead. Very high quality dust-proof concrete, and this was so that it could punch vertical penetrations in the exact location where in a typical office building that you couldn't. So we're thinking about indirect lighting, that we basically get a free ceiling in a building like this. That's the diagrid. You can see the limestone panels on a steel truss on the inside attached with these clips. And one of the things that, in the big picture thinking, a lot of smart people working on a project were thinking, okay, well, what does a new skin on a building cost? Call it nominally $100 and something. We left out the part to get rid of a wall like this is another $100 a foot nominal to get that off the building with union laborers, which is a challenge that we're dealing with right now. As opposed to reskinning a building that had windows, to get the wall off and start with a fresh start, it actually costs us money. Okay, so this is the view from the Brooklyn Bridge right now. This is a quick diagram of exposing that truss with the clearest possible low iron, low E glass. Further up on the bridge. Again, these are the Verizon floors right here where their switches are staying. And the building is actually very prominent from the steps of City Hall. And on this side, there's a circulation corridor here. We're actually leaving the vertical pattern and playing up a pattern based on the Brooklyn Bridge. Okay. And here we are back looking at the urban issue. Clearly, this neighborhood right here is very different, especially after 9/11, because we have one police plaza here that's protected with police barriers. Right here, we have the South Street Seaport Historic District. Pier 17 is being redone. We've done 16 buildings in the Seaport Historic District, and the only separation is really this one little link here. Right now, the building enters on the north side. You can see the implications of what that means to enter on the north side of a very tall building. So we're talking about moving the entry, or we're planning to move the entry to the south side right here. So it's both in the sun and looking out through this gap to the South Street Seaport and at the Brooklyn Bridge. That's another view from the south of the building. A detail of the curtain wall, how we're planning the curtain wall to reflect this free structure of the building, looking at ceramic frit shading patterns on the glass. This is the unit of measurement, so we have a deep shadow box capturing light. We're very interested in how this building that is now completely dead and dense and opaque could be open and transparent and vibrant, where you'd see the activity inside. View from the south at the street level, entering from the south, so that we now plan to enter from the south. And the challenge was to get people back to the core, which is a side load core in the rear portion of the project. So we're looking at amenities, restaurant, a bike port to connect to a bicycle path. It's amazing how many people actually bike and walk across the Brooklyn Bridge. So there's a very clear idea that this building could be a strong link to a working and living community across the bridge. We interviewed our office. 46% of our office actually lives in Brooklyn. View of the lobby. And the big challenge of how this building meets the ground. But just a huge challenge right now. This building didn't really meet the ground. It's actually been a blight on the neighborhood for a long time. And how we can re-engage. So we have a building that meets the sky in a different way, activates with the sun differently, and how it meets the ground. We hope to establish the start of a new neighborhood. So this is the view now approaching from the south as we're going ahead. So thank you very much for listening. That's our project at 375. We hope that if we do each one of these incrementally, we can really make a difference in our city.